This story takes place on a lake in central New Hampshire, just a few miles north of the base of Mount Kearsarge. My friend has a cabin there that his grandfather built shortly after returning from the Second World War. And on one warm summer night, between my junior and senior years of high school, he and I were there, just hanging out. While we did drink and partake in the ganja from time to time, we weren't intoxicated in any way on this specific night. We'd simply been bored in our little hometown, about 30 miles or approximately 48 kilometers to the south. So, on a whim, one evening, we decided to drive up and spend the night there to light a fire, sit by the water in beach chairs, and enjoy the nighttime t-shirt and swimming trunks weather while it lasted. I'd say it was about 9 or 10 p.m., and we had gotten up to inspect his granddad's old canoe that laid upside down atop the wooden dock. We wanted to use it the next day to head to the lone island. This way, we could look for loon nests and try to catch some hornpout. As we walked on the dock from where we had been sitting, I gazed across the lake at Mount Kearsarge. The mountain has a height of roughly 3,000 feet, or 895 meters, a prominence of 2,080 feet, or 630 meters. So, it was basically 2,000 feet straight up from our position, as we're only a couple of miles from its summit. It was quite an imposing figure in the night sky. Now, the mountain has a tower on the peak that flashes a red light at night. There is only one red light, and it is red. I had seen it so many times before. It was just a fact. However, as I followed my friend to the dock, I noticed there were two lights on this night, in addition to the usual red flashing light. There was a second yellow-orangish orb to its right, essentially about the same height. It wasn't moving, flashing, pulsating, nothing. It just hung there, motionless in the night sky. I told my friend, who was immediately interested, and so we both stood transfixed for a while before he asked me what I thought it was. I would have immediately considered helicopter, but it was so still and silent. After a few moments of silent staring, we both shrugged our shoulders, continuing on down to the canoe at the end of the dock. We inspected it for a while, placing it in the lake for check for leaks, deciding that it was definitely good to go for tomorrow, which was exciting. We were really looking forward to getting in the water. After looking it back to its original resting position, I turned to my right, bent down to wash the cobwebs off my fingers in the lake water. As I'm doing this, I returned my gaze to the mountain, and to my amazement, there were now two identical orbs, one on either side of the red, flashing light. I smacked my friend across the shoulder, told him to look up, and again, we just stared, transfixed. Although, this time, a little more anxiety-ridden. "What is that?" my friend said, with a bit of fear creeping into his voice. Without averting our gaze, we backpedaled to our chairs and began discussing possibilities. It is important to note that both of us were science-believing realists, and still are to this day. We also both accepted the distinct possibility that we, humanly, are most likely not alone, let alone the universe. Something, all the grains of sand on the earth, you know, the old Carl Sagan wordage. So we sat there discussing both the different paradoxes and the likelihood that it was just something visiting us. Perhaps something that was also temporary, human-made, that would sit on top of the mountain. Something had happened. Before our eyes, one of these orbs descended below the backside of the mountain and out of sight entirely in that amount of time. It was impossible for any helicopter or known human craft to do something like this. I'm sorry. I know I'm not no engineer or anything, but I know what a helicopter looks like when it descends in elevation. This was not like that at all. It sunk down and out of sight in less than 2 seconds, all without making any lateral movement whatsoever. We were stunned, but before we had time to wallow in this feeling or think about what could possibly be going on, the other orb took off from its position. It didn't gain or lose any elevation. It just took off horizontally at breakneck speed and began to make its way around the edge of the lake. It wasn't until the light was about halfway between its starting point and our position that we began to consider that it might be heading straight for us. We stood still at the shore, followed the object with our eyes. Out of sheer curiosity, and without speaking, we'd both made the unconscious decision to wait and see what would happen. I mean, what else were we supposed to do? At no point did we talk or look at each other. We just stood there, watching. Without leaving you in suspense for too long, the object did eventually arrive at where we were. And upon its arrival, it slowed to a crawl and creeped over us at a snail's pace. It was big. Not stereotypically a mothership, but big. I don't know exactly if I had to estimate, but I would say it was maybe 15 meters in length by 30 meters in width. It was shaped like a fat cigar and had 2 or 3 rows of orange lights on its bottom. I couldn't tell you what my friend was doing or how he was reacting, for I was entranced. I remember thinking that I had never, ever had an opportunity to view something like this, nor would I again. This was a once-in-a-lifetime experience, so I stared intensely, examining anything and everything I could about it. Unfortunately, there were no other details I could make out, only its approximate dimensions and the rows of lights. It made no sounds aside for what I perceived to be a very, very faint humming. There were no beams of light shooting down at us or anything, and we stood in the pitch blackness of the late New Hampshire night. I remember prepping myself for something to happen. Nothing did, and as soon as it creeped its way past, it took off as fast as it appeared, up in the night of the sky and out of sight. At that point, I shot my head back across the lake and towards the mountain. There was nothing but the normal, flashing red light remaining. All appeared to be back to normal for now. I don't think we said anything to each other aside from "let's get out of here," or something to that effect, before grabbing what little we had brought with us and hightailing it back to my friend's car. We drove the 30 miles back to our hometown, purchasing some snacks at the convenience store, returning to his house, where we proceeded to set up the same beach chairs that we had brought with us to the lake, in his backyard, where we stayed up for most of the night, to talk about what we had just seen. For the next few weeks, my mind could hardly focus on anything. I even told my parents at some point, but they sort of laughed it off, telling me I probably saw a helicopter or something. And after their reaction, I decided not to tell anybody else about the experience for years. Not until I was older, and gave no craps about what people would think. Also, did I begin to tell trusted friends about what had happened that night. My friend and I have since parted ways. We live across an ocean from each other now, and talk from time to time. In fact, I think it's been a few years since one of us has even brought it up. However, sitting here and running it down, going down the log of events, just has now made me want to reach out and talk with him again about it. I know what I saw. This thing was not constructed by humanity. We don't possess that sort of technology. And if we do, then there is far more hidden from the average citizen of Earth than I ever thought possible. But I'm digressing into conspiracy theories, and that is a path I try not to go down. The fact is that the possibility that we are not alone in the universe is so microscopically small. Consider this. There are billions of planets out there that are much, much older than Earth. All it would take is one of them to have a developed intelligent life a few million years ahead of us, giving them a massive head start in development of technology that would allow them to create machines that are capable of doing what the objects I saw that night did. So, I'm a very light sleeper. I wake up at the drop of a pin. Literally. Last night, I had a nightmare that my oldest son, of just 4 years old, was screaming and crying. His eyes were closed, and he was in his bed. I woke and just lay there, staring at the ceiling, wondering if it was a dream or if I really heard him crying. I heard a noise from the kitchen and saw a small light turn on. I thought to myself, oh great, one of them are up. So I get out of bed and looked out at the kitchen. Their door and gate was closed, and one of the boys' tablet's screen had lit up. Side note, I always plug their tablets at night and put them on the counter, standing up so they don't overheat. Their tablets have never just turned on before. We also don't keep any light plugs and lights on in our living room, since it is pitch black. I was confused, but went and locked the tablet screens, went to the restroom, and then back to bed. Keep in mind, I didn't turn on any lights doing all of this. I was in bed for about 3 minutes with my eyes closed, before I felt the urge to open them. The tablet screen was on again. I got up and looked out the doorway, more confused than ever, but went and locked the screen again. I hadn't even been back in bed a whole 30 seconds, and it turns on again. At this point, it was 3:20 a.m. My husband's alarm was set to go off at 3:30 a.m. for work. I elbowed him, told him what was happening. His response, "What?" Probably thinking I was half awake and dreaming. Then the tablet light went off again. I elbowed him a second time. "Did you see the light go off?" He whispered, "Yeah." We lay there for a few more moments, but felt like hours. I told him to get up and get the gun and make sure nobody was out there. He thought I was crazy, but I pointed out that I did not turn on any lights, so I didn't ever see if anybody else was out there. The tablets never do this. He got his gun and turned on all the lights, and no one was in here. I told him to just go turn on both of them, like power them off. He went to do it and heard the Amazon fire noise of each of them being turned off. Then he came back to our room and said, "Hey, I don't want to freak you out, but it was, child's name, tablet turning on and off." I told him to go check on them, and they were fine. My son, who I had the dream about, ended up coming to bed. He woke up and didn't feel comfortable with him not being right beside me. What a night. My ghost encounters in Jackson County, Mississippi. Let me start off by saying I've never had any mental problems that would cause me to hallucinate or see and hear things that aren't there. I've also been very sensitive to energies and things of the unknown and supernatural. So, here are just 2 of my encounters that happened a couple of weeks apart. I'll go ahead and set the scene for you. I was born and raised here in Mississippi. I'm a 33-year-old female. We've had all kinds of strange supernatural incidents. The Phantom Barber, the 1975 alien abduction, the haunted Longfellow House, the legend of the Singing River. Do yourself a favor and look that one up. There was even a little-known murder of a local teacher on her lunch break by a man committing a ritualistic satanic sacrifice. But I digress. At any rate, I still live here. I reside in Jackson County, the farthest south in the state you can possibly go. When someone thinks of Mississippi, the first thing people think is backwoods and hicks. This is not anything like that. A whole lot of suburbs. In fact, we are home to the largest employer in the state. Anything south of Interstate 10 is full-on city. But the first incident took place in Helena. It's about 10 minutes from here, and is sort of in the middle of nowhere, specifically where I was. It was 5 minutes north of Interstate 10. I was in a small trailer park accommodating 5 small trailers, far back off the road. If you were standing on the street, it looked like the driveway just went on into the woods indefinitely. When I first moved there with my friends and roommate Stacy, an older male friend, being in the trailer gave me the creeps. It always felt like somebody was watching me. Nothing serious, just a slight unease. Well, after about 8 months living there, my friend and her daughter came to stay with us while they looked for a place to live. The daughter was mixed and her mom was full white. This will be important later. Not long after they moved in, the activity picked up exponentially. Stacy never believed it, but her daughter, who I was close with, we'll call her P, and I would see things. At first, I thought I might be imagining things. That was until we saw the same stuff at the same time. At first, I was seeing an older and younger African American man for just a nanosecond. Then they were gone. Then, it started with the bathroom sink. I would hear it turn on and off again. I thought I was hearing, until one time I heard it. Ran into the bathroom. It was still on. I was home alone. Now, to have set up the next part, I have to tell you how the house is set up. At one end of it was the kitchen, then the living room. Then from there, the hallway starts. My room was first, then the bathroom, then lastly was Stacy's room. P was in the kitchen and I in my room. I heard the bathroom sink turn on. Confused, I stuck my head put while calling for P. But as soon as I did, it turned off, and P walked to the hallway from the kitchen and said, "Yeah?" She was basically behind me, trying to make sense of this, and I asked, "Were you just in the bathroom?" Her eyes got big, and she spoke nervously. "No, I thought that was you." Now, P is not easily scared. I've known her to be scared of anything, but at that moment, I could tell she was. A few days later, I had P take me in my car, since I was too tired to drive and it was now about 10 p.m., to go to Walmart. My car was parked to the right of Stacy's. When we went to pull out, we would make a 3-point turn. Because of this, the driver's side windows would be facing the back of his truck. Well, as we were about to put the gear into drive from reverse, I reached to grab my purse from the floorboard of the driver's seat and just so happened to look up. That's when I saw it. Next to Stacy's tailgate. It looked like a man sitting. A white man in a black hooded robe with a skull painted on his face. Let me remind you, we're here in the middle of nowhere, in the woods. I didn't say a word. I just ducked down, now staring at the inside of the driver's door. P began to ask what was wrong. I said, "What are you doing? Oh my, look at the windows down." She throws it in drive. We must have slung rocks all the way to the road. Now, my theory is that I know I'm sensitive, but from what I can tell, so is P. I also feel like somebody who owned the land in the past may have sacrificed slaves, possibly children in some bizarre satanic ritual. When P moved, it triggered something. I later told an old neighbor about the story. She turned pale and her jaw hit the floor. Stumbling over her words, she told me about how her young children used to ask her if they could go play with the kids outside. There were no other kids around. Here's the second story. About 2 weeks later, I had P take me, again at nighttime, to the St. Andrews area of Ocean Springs, Mississippi. It's only 2 towns over from here. St. Andrews is vastly undeveloped, with trees virtually everywhere. The place I was going was on a road that had trees on one side, maybe one house on the other. Let's just say it's mostly woods. When we pulled up, she just pulled into the yard. I went inside to take my friend and borrow some money from him. When I came back out, the car was now parked parallel to the curb. I can now see the majority of the car still from the porch, aside from the back windshield, as it was obstructed by a tree that was in my line of sight. I could see the front part and the trunk. And I saw a figure standing by the driver's door, which at first I assumed to be P. Once my eyes adjusted, I could see it was an old white man. Red short-sleeved button-up and navy blue slacks. His gray and white hair was slicked back. He had his hand placed on the driver's door, like he was trying to get in. Once I realized it wasn't P, I yelled, "Hey, what are you doing?" He turned to look at me, then started towards the back of the car. But once he began walking behind the tree, he disappeared. Stunned, but worried about my friend, I sprinted to the car. As I made it to the car, she unlocked the door, while simultaneously jumping into the passenger seat. P was frantic, no color on her face. I asked what had happened. She managed to get this out. "He was trying to get the door open." I asked where he came from, and without missing a beat, she replied, "The woods. Where'd he go?" I told her he disappeared behind the tree, and all she could manage to articulate was, "Why does this keep happening to us?" It's been a few years now, and P and I don't really talk anymore. I think since we're both sensitive, together, we've attracted paranormal going-ons. It's probably safer for both of us that we don't really hang out anymore. Hey guys. So, I'm not a writer, so deal with it. This story happened to me 7 years ago. I was 21 years old at the time, and to this day, I still don't know what I saw. My last class of the day was around 8 to 9 p.m. I was tired, but still joking with my friends about how a 1-hour class turned into a 3.5-hour speech about STDs. Suddenly, I felt my chest hurt, like it's never before, and I felt really sad out of nowhere. Like I had a really, really bad feeling. Impending doom. So, I get into my car, speed off to home. Physically, I was okay, but this devastating feeling was not going away. On my usual way home, I always drive under a poorly illuminated short bridge. When I passed it completely, I see this dark creature sitting on the hood of my car, watching me. It was like a gargoyle, the size of a teen or so, completely dark, almost black, with unspread wings. It wasn't moving at all. It just kept watching me. So I kept driving, telling myself that it was just my mind. "You're scared, that's all." I kept repeating to myself like my own mantra. The thing is, what I was seeing, this creature didn't scare me. I was so starstruck that it calmed me down somehow. But I knew something awful was about to happen. This visualization was like a confirmation. I don't know how, but it was like the gargoyle was telling me his eyes, "I'm sorry it has to be this way." When I finally got home, it was dark. No lights were on outside, which was weird. They were always left on at night. Always. Then, I realized something. My brother was looking through the blinds and opened the door for me. His face was blank of expression. I asked where our parents were, and he said, "Yeah, Grandma called 30 minutes ago. Grandfather fell from the roof of the house. They went there to help." Just like that, the pressure lifted off my chest, everything clicking into place. Doomsday became real, because sadly, he died that night of October due to severe brain trauma. Earlier that year around May, he was repairing the rooftop of his house when he suddenly had a heart attack. He went into immediate emergency surgery, and everything went okay, as it be. The cardiologist told him to wait a month before returning to regular activities. So, he told Grandma that the roof had to wait a bit, but he would finish it. Later on in June, one night, he kept hearing his dogs barking. So, upon going outside to check on them, on the front fence, he saw this homeless guy who was asking for money to get something to eat. My grandpa told him to wait. He would just get him a plate of food. So, when he was turning around to go back to the house, the guy grabbed a sawed-off shotgun from his bike and shot him. Then the man ran off. Nothing was missing. My grandpa went into surgery, lost a lot of blood. He even needed transfusions, and the surgeon had to remove a foot of intestine due to the injuries. When we went to see him in the hospital, he was somehow cheerful, said he wasn't in any pain. Then he mentioned that he knew that he had protection, because it was like he had a shield that covered him. He knew he was not going to die that night, even when he was lying on the floor, dragging himself and yelling to my grandmother to call 911. Also, during our visit, he said to my grandmother, "Don't worry, I'm not going anywhere until I finish the roof and leave you with no problems." The day my grandfather died, he was just finishing the roof. I grew up on a farm just outside of Limerick in Ireland, which, as you can imagine, made for quite an eventful upbringing. It also meant my back garden was bloody massive, so I had plenty of space to run around outside, playing make-believe with my two sisters. Without a shadow of a doubt, our favorite toy was the little windy house that Dad had built for us that sat just at the end of the garden. I don't know if they have those in the rest of the world, but basically, a windy house is like a little miniature playhouse, just for kids. I say little, but Dad had built us a massive one, with like a little hallway and a kitchenette, and a little ladder going upstairs to a play loft. It was absolutely adorable. Me and my sisters loved it. So much so that one summer's night, when it was warm enough, we asked Mom and Dad if we could sleep out in the windy house one night. They were understandably reluctant to give us permission at first, but upon pestering them and pestering them, they finally relented. We could have a sleepover in the windy house, but we had to be on our best behavior, not fight, and promise not to go walking around in the dark. It was a deal. You can understand our parents' reservations too, because the end of the garden I mentioned was probably roughly 100 meters away from the actual house, near this old shuck that backed out onto some woodland. Not the ideal place to leave your kids alone overnight. So, that's how 3 girls under 10 years old ended up in a dimly lit, wooded playhouse, in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the night. For some reason, my older sister Kathleen decides it would be a great idea to tell some ghost stories. Kathleen has always been a bit strange. She's always had this fascination with ghosts and ghoulies and witches and whatnot, ever since she was little. And since she had gotten her hands on a book of Irish ghost stories, she thought she might regurgitate one of these stories that she's read to us. She began telling us about a ghost that actually originated here in Ireland. That, unlike Dracula or Frankenstein, which comes from other countries, as 9-year-old her put it, we actually had banshees in Ireland, since that is where they originated from. Our minds are absolutely blown. Ghosts live in graveyards, old houses, and other haunted places. You had to go to the haunted place to see one. But here's Kathleen, telling us about how a ghost that actually comes to you, to tell you that someone's going to die in your family. And the way it lets you know this is by screaming in the middle of the night, like a ghostly, ear-piercing wail. Kathleen goes on to tell us that these banshees are women who have died in terrible, horrific, painful ways. Hence the screaming. And they looked like shriveled old women with red eyes, who carried bowls of blood. We were just about trembling in our pajamas by the time Kathleen finished describing this nightmarish appearance of the banshee by torchlight. Somehow, when Dad came to interrupt and tell us it was bedtime, we still managed to get comfy and drift off to a rather uneasy sleep. The next thing I know, I'm now awake in total darkness. Everything is deathly quiet. Then, I hear something that was so frightening that at first, I think I just froze up in complete terror. It was this shrill, ear-piercing shriek, almost gravelly too, as if it had come from the throat of an old woman. When I finally found the courage to move, I shut up from my makeshift bed, shaking my sisters awake, telling them to listen. We sat there in the darkness for a moment, all three of us terrified. Then, we heard the screech again. That's when we decided to listen closer. We just sat there in the darkness for a moment. Shh. All three of us, scared out of our mind. We heard it for a second time, and just about my mind was so filled with fear. My little sister, she took it even worse. She screamed it's a banshee, and I remember her crying, "We have to tell Mom and Dad." Then my big sister, God bless her, decides that even though she's terrified, she is going to go run to Mom and Dad so they can rescue us from the banshee. I mean, what else could we have done? What else could have been making these ungodly noises? We're frantically looking for our torches, but in our panic, we can't find them. When the banshee screams for a third time, Kathleen decides she can't afford to wait another second. She gets up in complete darkness, climbs down the little ladder, and opens the Wendy house door. She runs off and fetches rescue. While Kathleen was gone, me and my little sister managed to find one of the torches. We flick it on and point it down at the Wendy house door from the loft. You know, I don't know what the logic of that was, but that's what we did. We cuddled together, we cried, and we waited for the banshee to come get us. After a minute or so, we hear rustling outside the Wendy house. Something was moving just outside. We're so scared of the thing that's hearing us. We've got our hands over our mouths, but we still can't stop crying, and we still don't turn the torches off. Suddenly, the door opens, and what stepped inside made me and my little sister scream in pure horror. Blood was pouring down the mouth and chin of my big sister, and now she's back in the light. Now she too can see that she's bleeding. She smears a bit of blood on her fingers, looks at it, then promptly collapses. We are absolutely inconsolable at this point. So, me and my little sister are begging, screaming, crying for our parents to come and save us. To us, Kathleen just ran up to get help, and the bloody banshee's only gone and gotten her before she could make it. We're trapped, and this banshee is now getting closer. We're doomed. Then, there's more footsteps outside the Wendy house. Heavier footsteps now. Banshee footsteps. The door swings open again, only this time, the face of our dad appears, wanting to know what is going on out here. And we're screaming, "Dad, there's a banshee, be careful. It got Kathleen, behind you." He's obviously skeptical as anything at first, but he sees Kathleen's face. Now it is his turn to be terrified. He turns ashen and grabs Kathleen's little body up in his arms, rushes back to the house with her. So keep in mind that even at this, the point of parental intervention, Dad has not taken the time to tell us that there definitely is not a banshee. And if anything, his reaction at Kathleen's face confirmed that not only is there definitely a banshee outside, but he's completely abandoned us. Seriously, just try and imagine being 7 and that being your truth. We didn't calm down for hours. Mom and Dad say we were still up crying at 1 o'clock in the morning, with the whole incident going on at about 10. Even when we knew everything was okay, we just cried because it'd been so traumatic. Obviously, there was no banshee. We didn't find this out till years later, for obvious reasons. But what we had heard as the sound of 2 foxes making love. As me and my sisters know too well, when they do that, the lady fox screeches, producing what is a rather unsettling, unworldly sound. Kathleen, being the big, brave sister she was, had ran out to protect us. But maybe if she was as nimble as she was courageous, she would not have run directly into that tree in her blind panic, almost knocking herself out in the process. Best she could do was retrace her poor, befuzzled steps back to the Windy house and pass out at the sight of her own blood. It's a story we tell every Christmas now, especially whenever there's a new boyfriend or husband making an appearance. It always gets a laugh or 2. But I think if you put a gun to my head and asked me for the scariest moment of my life, I'd say the banshee when I was 7. I'm deadly serious. Scarier than childbirth. Scarier than finding the lump in my breast. Scarier than confronting my first husband about his drinking. Because I believed in something I didn't understand. Something supposedly mythical. Something that even my dad was scared of. Needless to say, there were no more sleepovers in the Windy house that summer. And the whole thing went arseways and fell down a few years later. But me and my sister will always have a story to share. We were scared for our lives. I'm not sure if this is the type of story, what you're looking for, but it was creepy and alarming, enough to stick with me. This was over a year or 2 ago. I'm a young 20-something living in Southern California, in the San Diego area. I live with my family, including my older sister. We'll call her Eliza. We had a cousin, who we'll call Jerry, visiting us from out of country. And as he and my sister are particularly close due to them being closer in age, she took it upon herself to be his tour guide, since he hadn't been to California since he was a small child. Eliza and Jerry are big fans of pop culture, particularly pop music. There was a fairly famous pop singer performing here in Los Angeles, which is a bit of a ways away from where we all live. Eliza was a huge fan, and she actually bought tickets specifically for Jerry and her so they could go during the visit. At first, I was a bit salty that I was not invited, so whatever. Not wanting to miss out on a fun day trip, I decided to invite 2 of my close friends, who we'll call Savannah and Eric, who were something of a couple at the time. I don't have my license, but both of them do. So that way, once Jerry and Eliza got to the show, we could still drive around and do whatever. My sister drove the 5 of us to Los Angeles. She and Jerry in the front, with Savannah, Eric, and me in the back. Despite being a casual fan of the artist they were going to go see, Eliza and Jerry played the artist on repeat the entire time, with traffic over a 3-hour trip. Mind you, this artist only had like 3 albums at the time, and so it got pretty old really quick. My friends and I tend to like softer, more rock type music, so we can assure that this was more than enough. Anyway, once we got to LA, around noon, we were all hungry in need of the restroom. Being in LA, it's hard to find available clean restrooms to use whenever. I suspect it's due to the constant use of homelessness, and thus many places are not open to public without purchasing something. So, not only was the constant need to find restrooms a bit frustrating, but finding food we could all agree on was also adding to the stress. Jerry had never tried ramen before, since traditional Japanese food isn't easily found where he lives. Anyway, Jerry and Eliza were totally in their own world, like literally getting pumped for the show later that night. Eliza would ignore whatever my friends and I requested to do during our time, and definitely played the "I'm older than you" and been around for longer. We dropped the two off, and the rest of the night was fun, just as it always is when the three of us hang out. We went to Santa Monica, watched the sunset, and walked around a bit. By the time we were starting to get hungry, we checked out Yelp and found a burger place that looked amazing, as well as suited our tight budget. I don't go to LA often, so when we pulled the directions out and got there, I was not aware of which part we were exactly in. We were looking to park, but a group of what appeared to be gang members stood in front of the spot we were going to park. They began approaching the car and putting their hands on the exterior while looking into the window. Eric was driving and said something to the effect of, "You guys fine with parking here?" Not fine with parking there, but Eliza and I told them we needed to pack up and find somewhere else. I've always been extremely cautious, especially in LA, since I've had a few other unsavory experiences, including the time a man followed me and my friend into our car, and we had to shove him out. So there's no way in hell I felt good parking there. We drove a few blocks, starving and ready to just forget it all. That's when we found a clear spot in a well-populated area. The food was great and all was well. Aside from the bunches of homeless that I saw around me, pretty common in any part of LA you find, I didn't even realize we had been in the heart of Skid Row. Once we made our way over, though, we discovered that the place we wanted to eat was in the midst of Skid Row. For those who don't know anything about LA, Skid Row is a neighborhood in downtown Los Angeles that extends about roughly 50 blocks. It's mostly home to the homeless. There are also a lot of dealers and ladies of the night that hang around too. We were walking back to our car, and I looked up to one of the taller buildings, right along the block. The sign at the side on the top of the building read, "Hotel Cecil, low weekly rates, 700 rooms." This hotel could be a post in and of itself, but in short, it's an old hotel that briefly was in its prime back in the 1920s and 30s. But as the Depression struck, the hotel and its entire ambiance went down with it. It had been known for housing some of society's unsavory, such as the homeless, and those in the entire drug and sex industry, along with a few infamous guests, such as the Night Stalker, Richard Ramirez, just to name a few. It's supposed to be vacant as of now, but as far as I could see, I'm pretty sure there was ongoing activity within the building and all around it. Squatters, I'm assuming. I don't believe in the paranormal or anything like that, but I can confirm the unanimous thought that place gives off is really sketchy, creepy. Once I realized that's where we were, my friends and I booked it to the car. Thankfully, nothing happened, but naturally, I was on edge a bit after that. We stopped to pick up some pie at a shop that Eric was obsessed with, since it was on our way to the venue Eliza and Jerry were at. We thought we had plenty of time, but by the time we got to eating, Eliza called me and demanded we come over immediately. I knew nothing was wrong, so I did hurry a bit, but we decided to finish our pies before heading off. Eliza kept texting me with impatience, saying things like, "Waiting here is boring. Where are you? We're tired. We want to go now." You know, the typical bossy older sister things. She was kind of a jerk to me the entire day anyway, so I guess I used that to justify my jerkiness back. But then, we had another bump in the road. The pie Savannah tried had peanuts cooked into the crust, and she got so sick. We rushed out of there and tried to stop somewhere for water and antihistamine, since she did not have her EpiPen. She began feeling a tad better, but she was still really sick. Now I'm stressed and worried. Once we got to the venue, Eliza and Jerry took forever to come out. I guess they started waiting to see if they could meet the artist. Once they finally came in, Eric and I shuffled to the back seat. Eliza had the nerve to yell at me for taking so long. We had to stop a few times so Savannah could throw up and rehydrate. On top of that, Eliza and Jerry continued to play the same artist again and again and again. With Savannah sick, Eric as aloof as ever, and me stressing on edge about everything that had happened thus far, I was just ready to bang my head against the window. I know, in the scheme of things, these aren't big deals, but by the time they were all adding up, especially my sick friend and the bad attitude of my sister, it drove me up the wall. So, we dropped Eric and Savannah off first, since their town was on the way before ours. Now it's around 1 in the morning. At that point, I was sick and tired of all the music and loud talking. I just wanted it done. I was that level of mad when you're quite angry. So, once the two left, I left the car and demanded that I drove home the rest of the way. Mostly so I could DJ. Once again, I am up the wall, very on edge. I play music as I drive us home and everything seems fine. It's almost when something happens. Our house is off the major freeway in town, though it's a bit of a lonely, desolate area. To get to our place, you have to pass a hilltop with other houses, make a turnaround to get to our neighborhood. There's a cemented patch of grass between a stretch of concrete, between the hill and the turn that's used as a divider between the oncoming and ongoing traffic. As I'm approaching, coming up to make my turn around the hill, on my left, I see something that's creeped me out and been on my mind ever since. At this point, it's roughly 2 in the morning. The area isn't too busy. This late at night, this early in the morning, on the grass divider and along the cement, there are people lined along the thinner cement part of the divider and on the grass patch. A small crowd. There was at least 15, and they were all wearing white. I could see them perfectly with my lights and the brightness of their clothes. And they were moving around, almost doing a jig when I came up. As I was driving next to them, unable to take my eyes off, they started raising their voices, all talking at once. I could hear it through the window and over my music. Then, they all in unison started sprinting toward me, trying to get my attention, and following along as I pulled to the right to make my turn. They literally were following me, talking to us. It was the most bizarre, creepy thing. I can't say for sure, but their outfits were akin to KKK, but different. I'm obviously having a what is going on moment. I didn't have a clue about what I saw, but of course, I knew I did see something. I scream in panic and ask Eliza and Jerry if they saw. Of course they had. But I know what I saw, whatever they were. Some of their faces were covered, and I know I saw a man who had a beard, and they were rushing over, and I got the feeling they wanted me to stop the car. I know people sometimes create diversions or distractions, like that for their own nefarious reasons, to target drivers. I'm not sure what it is they were going to do. The town I live in is small, old, and somewhat rural. We're known as one of the most conservative towns in the US, so I guess it could have been something like the KKK, or due to the way they're dressed, there are also some known observers of the occult. I don't know. Eliza and Jerry got irritated with me. I drove around the block past our own a few times, rather than immediately pulling into our street. I was pretty sure they were not following anymore. I told our mother about this. She believed me, I think to an extent, but I mean, it does sound really absurd. And my sister to this day claims that it never happened. She even refuses to believe or acknowledge I was the one driving. But I know at the very least, this happened. Be careful, guys. When you go out of town, especially to a place like Los Angeles, you can expect some weird stuff. But the strangest, and possibly the most dangerous ones, were just a little over a block away from my house, lurking in the dark, waiting for some passing motorist to stop and talk to them. Or maybe something far more evil than just talking. Childhood paranormal experience. Around 1986, a toddler-sized talking doll, whose name I'm still too superstitious to repeat, hit the market. She had blonde, curly ringlets and large blue eyes that moved around right when she talked. The sounds she made came from a cassette player that was built into her back, and her rubber mouth would open and close along with the audio. The first time I saw one of these dolls in person was at a friend's house. For the next year, I would persistently beg my parents for that doll. When I was 8, they surprised me with one for my birthday. Between 1988 and 1989, the doll and I got along well. I began to outgrow the cutesy and babyish cassettes that came with her, so sometimes I would just put random tapes in her back, even music. I would laugh hysterically as her mouth and eyes moved along with everything from classical music to my dad's boring financial tutorials, narrated by a droning male voice. That man's voice emanating from the doll's mouth was totally creepy, but even more hilarious. I inevitably got bored of this, but for at least a year, I had some good times. It was towards the end of my 4th grade school year in 1989, and one night, I was getting ready for bed. This night was marked by a gradual uneasiness, which began out as a barely noticeable, but by the time I was in bed, I began to worry that I may never get sleep. It was odd. I mean, there was nothing in particular that I was anticipating or that was bothering me. No class trips, tests, or anything that might trigger a sleepless night. I wondered if I was coming down with something. I was feeling ever so slightly unwell, and the sensations in my body were causing me a great deal of anxiety. I laid with this discomfort for at least 2 hours, wanting to toss and turn, but felt too emotionally paralyzed to move. For some reason, I wanted to face the wall. In fact, I was afraid to face the open space, and a sense of dread had emerged. I remembered what my mom told me about not being able to sleep. She recommended that I did not force myself to close my eyes, so I left them open. Periodically, my eyelids would close, but then my awareness of them closing would wake me up. Another hour went by. I was used to hearing the occasional whirring of cars, but after laying awake for so long, the traffic noise gradually ceased. The quietness of the room was distracting. Judging by the lack of street noise, I'm guessing that it was 3 or even 4 in the morning. Then, I heard something impossibly bizarre and barely audible. My baby brother's crib was across the room by the window. He was not talking yet, and no more than a couple of words at most. Certainly not counting. But I heard him not just counting, but doing it backwards from 10. Every number was spoken in an exaggerated, drawn-out, sing-song voice that started from a lower tone and eventually made its way to a higher one. I peeked quickly over my shoulder to look at the crib, but it looked like he was asleep. 10, 9, 8, 7. I pulled the covers tightly around my body, tried to convince myself that I didn't hear what I was hearing. After all, the volume of that tiny voice was extremely low. Perhaps the baby was babbling in her sleep, and my brain was trying to make sense of it. Could I have dozed off? Well, that's the thing. I'd been awake the entire night. 5, 4, etc. Then, a faint clicking sound came from the corner beside my brother's crib. There was a small wooden chair in the corner. Each of its legs had a metal wheel which clicked in such a way when the chair was being moved. It was unmistakable. The chair was moving on its own. I didn't dare to turn to look. I was depending on the last ounce of denial that I could possibly muster. The worst thing about this chair, other than its sudden independent movement, was that the permanent residence of this doll, when it was not in use, was there. I knew she was sitting on that chair before I got into bed. Then, it felt as though the air was sucked out of the room, and all I could hear was the audible clicking of the chair's wheels as they inched closer and closer to my bed. I began to call out for my parents, but I was unable to yell loudly enough. The fear was so intense I could barely move. Eventually, I decided that I should just make a run for the door and hope for the best. The problem was that in order to get out of the room, I would have to risk looking at that doll. Finally, able to move a bit, that's when I made the mistake of turning my head too far around, and I saw the doll in her chair inches away from my bed. What's even worse is that her face was contorted in such a way that, as an adult, I can compare to Regan from The Exorcist. But as a 9-year-old, I had no concept of this. The doll's eyes were also looking upward, but slightly to the corner, creating an absolutely horrifying image I'll never forget. That's when I let out a powerful shriek. I did so reflexively, and it was almost like listening to somebody else's scream. When my parents came running in, the doll was back in her corner, and I was never believed. I slept in my parents' bed that night, and they were angry at me. I dreamt that the car was driving in circles around some suburban neighborhood that I'd never seen before. Living alone with the aftermath of this experience was traumatic in and of itself. The following week, I was so paranoid about seeing inanimate objects doing things they weren't supposed to that I jumped to conclusions about certain things. For instance, the shampoo and conditioner that was in the shower one evening felt significantly heavier than they did the day earlier. I was afraid that the substance somehow materialized at will. My mom just insisted that water probably got in it, but it had not. I turned the bottles over. No excess water came out. Perhaps it was my paranoia, but I'm not ruling anything out anymore. Not after what I experienced. It took me several months to feel somewhat normal again, and even to this day, I'm still affected by this incident. I've always known that unexplained entities exist. I just have. I have never had a significant experience, such as an apparition, and I'm thankful, and I'd rather not, to be honest. But I've experienced minor things here and there. 2 experiences I can recount occurred at my Oma, which is the German word for grandma, and Opa's house here in Hawaii. I've also had quite a few family members share their more terrifying experiences with me over the years, which also happened in said house. But let's start with my own, for my most recent experiences. I am currently a 27-year-old female, ancient, I know, and would often sleep over at Oma's house from 5 to 15 years old, mostly on weekends. I enjoyed being there, as she and I were very close. She would spoil me from when I could first talk, up until she lost her memory to dementia. Yeah, that depressing evil disease that causes everybody you love some major suffering as you slowly forget who you are and your family members are. Anyway, she was always a huge jokester, always laughing, farting, tickling, making sarcastic remarks, and jumping out to scare any and all of her family members. It was a Friday night, and I was 14 years old. I was on the PC they had in their designated computer room, because I couldn't sleep. The room is about the size of a bigger closet, just big enough to comfortably fit a desk. The room is also kind of weird, if you understand what I mean. If you're sitting on the chair facing the PC, the door is behind and to the left of you, so you can't see if somebody comes in unless you turn to the left. Directly across the hallway is the room I would sleep in, and if you were to take the right outside of the room, you would see my grandparents' room at the other end of the hallway. Now, I always had an ominous feeling of being in that house, especially when night would fall, and especially after my grandparents went to bed. I was the only one awake. So there I was, on MSN Messenger, talking with one of my friends. The clock showed something like 1 or 2 a.m. I was beginning to get sleepy, but being a teen, it'd be way too uncool to sleep early on a Friday night. Because I was a bit distracted, I felt completely at ease. No spooky feelings or chill in the air, nor was I the slightest bit paranoid. That is, until I feel somebody blow lightly in my left ear. 2 times, back to back. "Oma," I exclaimed, beginning to laugh and turning to face her. She wasn't there. It was no one. "Oma," I called, while standing up out of the chair, fully expecting her to be hiding in my temporary room. As I peeked in, ready to surprise her, I then began to look down the dark hallway, knowing her room door, which would be open, provided she snuck out to scare me. Closed. The door was closed. She always slept with it closed. She had not been the one to blow in my ear. My grandpa certainly isn't the type to play pranks. He's an old school guy from the Philippines. This is the last thing he would ever do, nor is he fast enough to pull this sort of thing off. I was the only person in this entire house aside from them. If it wasn't either of them, who was it? Has anybody else felt something like this before that doesn't involve touching? My second encounter happened several years before this one. It was a holiday evening, sometime back in the mid-2000s, and all of my oldest children, out of 4 being my mom, and their spouses and their children, were over. I was around 9 years old and filled with energy. My cousin Derek, who was around 7, we were tossing a tennis ball back and forth in the house on the very first floor. Everyone was either in the living room, kitchen, or the front yard. There was a carpeted staircase that ran perpendicular from the living room and straight up to the second floor. From the bottom of the staircase, you could see the most of the living room, and obviously up the stairs. From the top of the staircase, you could see the stairwell down to the bottom, and a very small fraction of the living room. It consisted of about 15 stairs and had its own light bulb, so nobody would have to blindly walk the stairs at night. We decided to move the ball tossing to the stairs. Why not? I was on the very top, and Derek at the bottom. We were bouncing the ball lightly up and down the stairs for about 15 minutes, until our parents told us to go eat dinner. I caught the ball and flicked the light switch for the stairwell to down position to turn the light off, then ran down the stairs to get food. After making our plate, we all sat in the living room. "Can you turn the light off?" my auntie asks me, being the last one to use the light in the stairwell. Puzzled, I looked up at the now illuminated bulb. I set my plate on the table, charged up the stairs, and flicked the switch down again, ran back down the stairs. A few minutes go by, and we're shoveling our faces. "I thought Auntie Tammy asked you to turn the light off," my mom questions me. My heart sank as I looked up and I see the stairlight on once again. "I turned it off," I said confidently. The switch was up, so I made sure to turn it down and saw the light shut off visibly while I was up there. My mom just looked at me unconvinced. "I don't think so," she says. "No, I saw her turn it off," my auntie explains. I saw it turn back on too when she came downstairs after a few seconds, but I didn't want to say anything. My grandparents have passed away for some years now, and the house has been sold. A decision that was agreed upon by their very children. Not a single good dream. They always involve an evil, honest to God. They've never been good. Not a single good dream. Anyway, my entire family knows the new owners of the house, and they are contacted every so often. Apparently, they've had quite a few unexplainable occurrences of their own since moving in, dark entities in the house. I'm curious to know if anybody has any idea of what all of this means. Is it evil? Are these entities good or bad? Or am I just paranoid? Do my dreams carry any sort of truth to them? Please, I would love to know. Many years ago, when I was young and fit, I was out exercising before dawn. Our local cemetery was high on a hill, and I would walk up said hill, then jog all around the concrete and gravel roads that wound in and around the graves. I had done this many prior mornings, and I was not afraid of being in the graveyard pre-daylight. I had family and friends there, buried there, of course. It was isolated. I felt safe. One of the individuals interred there was a little girl named Kay. Kay was only 12 and starting junior high school when an impatient idiot behind the wheel of a car killed her. On my frequent runs past Kay's well-kept grave, I often greeted her, wished her well, and expressed my sorrow regarding her short, sweet life. On this particular morning of which I write, I jogged past her grave and called out a greeting. In my head, she spoke urgently to me. "It's not safe up here this morning." I jogged on, a bit startled. Of course, I glanced about, but all was normal. A few minutes later, Kay spoke again. "There's a man up here." This time I stopped. Suddenly, the dark hilltop seemed fraught with danger. My blood ran cold, and the hair on the back of my neck stood up, were no longer cliches. Still, I saw nothing. No man, no movement. But by now, every nerve in my body was screaming for me to get out of there now. I turned and ran. It was no longer a casual morning jog. It was a sprint for my life. I ran past Kay's grave and back down the steep hill, caring not that my quadriceps complained. As I fled, I listened for any pursuers, but I heard none. But that did not lessen the overwhelming sense of peril that kept me running hard even after I exited the steep part of my route. The rest of that day, and even the remainder of the week, I listened for news of an escaped convict, a murderous madman, or anything that would explain Kay's urgent warning. There was none. I had no doubt then, nor do I many years later, that I was in peril that morning. From whom, I do not know. But 15 years have passed, and I can still recall with crystal clarity those two sentences from a poor child put much too early in her grave. Thank you. When I was 11, we lived in the middle of nowhere, Minnesota. The house we lived on was top of a giant hill with a really steep driveway. In the winter, we would sled down it, which stopped at the edge of the dirt road and ran past our place. We had a ridgeback mixed dog named Sammy that liked to chase us as we sled down the hill. Unfortunately, he also liked to chase cars. You could see where this is going. My sister sat up on top of the hill, watching me sled down with Sammy chasing behind. When I stopped at the bottom, I noticed this maroon van coming towards me. For some reason, I was frozen in place. Sammy saw it coming and instantly stood at the side of the road in front of me, barking at the car. My sister was yelling at me to run up the hill so Sammy would chase me instead, but I was frozen. It all happened within seconds. The van refusing to brake or slow down. They just plowed right over him, right in front of me. Literally 10 feet or less in front of me. They must have seen him. They must have seen me. They didn't stop. They didn't care. Just kept driving. A chunk of their bumper broke off, for Pete's sakes. I heard my sister screaming and crying at the top of the hill as we see Sammy lying there, motionless. So, me being the oldest, I thought I'd better get Mom. My sister being paralyzed with grief. So I run all the way up the hill and got our parents. My mother picked him up, ran him to the car, immediately to the vet. Later that night when she got back, he was dead. They were going to have to bury him the next day. For some reason, when my mom thought we'd need some kind of closure, she put his body wrapped in a blanket in the porch by the back door. His head was exposed, and his eyes were still open. It was terrifying. That night, I had a dream that Sammy ran up the stairs and into my bedroom. In my sleep, my right hand was hanging over the bed, and in the dream, he came and licked it. I woke up screaming in terror. It was the most realistic dream I had ever experienced. When my mom came in my room and asked what happened, her response was, he was just coming to say goodbye. As a child, I frequently watched horror films and ghost hunting shows. I was always fascinated by the paranormal. However, I never imagined that I would have my own real-life ghost story that came together in the form of multiple experiences and a dream to connect all the dots. Prior to my story, I had multiple paranormal experiences that left me as a firm believer, long before I was ever 14. However, the story I will tell you now happened between October and November of 2014. I had just begun my freshman year of high school at a private school here in Northern California. It all started on a random October night when I was jolted awake for no apparent reason at 2 a.m. This was unusual for me, as I never ever wake up in the middle of the night, and if I do, it's to grab a sip of water and then drift off into sleep within minutes. However, this time was weird. I awoke to a wall of silence that was so great I could practically hear static in the air. You know when you are sitting in a room with someone and you don't know too well in awkward silence? You could see them gearing up to speak. Well, that is what it felt like in my room. But obviously, I couldn't see anybody else there, and the feeling of awkwardness was replaced by fear. Well, since this had never happened to me before, I tried to ignore this odd feeling, and I turned over trying to force myself back to sleep. Just as I began to feel myself relax, I heard a voice from the corner of my room say very clearly, "Hello." Within seconds, I was running up and down the hall, screaming for my parents, who frantically woke up, searched my entire room, looking for the person I was so convinced was in my room. Obviously, they didn't find anyone, but I was shaken and slept in my sister's room for about 2 weeks after. After a while, I had convinced myself that this was some random isolated incident. But what I found the most odd was that the voice didn't have a gender. It was just a voice, nothing more than that. This helped me to convince myself that perhaps it was not a voice at all. Instead, something I had imagined or a random noise that I had interpreted as a voice. So, after a while, I let it go, began to sleep in my own room again. Now, at this point, it was early November, and I had been sleeping in my room again without incident for an entire week. That is, until it happened again. It was like clockwork, man, where I abruptly awoke at 1:56 a.m. for no reason, and the same feeling of silence and static filled the air. However, as scared as I was, I remained in my bed and reassured myself that what happened last time was all just in my head. However, I was proved wrong when the same corner of my room, I heard the exact same laugh. Except it wasn't the sound of someone laughing. It was someone saying the words, "Aha, ha, ha." Now, I don't know about you, but I can't think of any wind, my dogs, or really anything that could make this noise, or anything that could speak. Let me tell you, I was out of my room screaming for my parents within seconds. They were, of course, concerned that I believed somebody was again in my room, But they were mostly irritated I had disrupted their sleep because of what they believed to be my imagination. So, at this point, I was convinced that my room that I had slept in without incident for 8 years now was haunted. And believe me, I didn't know how to explain it either. I began to beg my parents to do research on our home and see if there was any way it could possibly be haunted. However, given that our house was built in 2008, we're the only people to ever live in it. They would just roll their eyes and told me there was no way. However, I will never forget Thanksgiving morning when it all came together. I awoke that morning after having a dream so vivid and true. It feels as if I'm reliving it, simply by typing it here. In my dream, I am at the end of the hallway, running frantically towards my closed bedroom door at the end of the hallway. Except, my house is in flames all around me, and as fast as I can run, it seems I can never reach my bedroom door. Finally, I reach my door, but laying on the ground is a piece of paper that I lean down and pick up. Written on it, in messy handwriting, it says, "No one goes in insert room's name anymore because of Charlie Bennett." Suddenly, my door opens and there stands a tall man in his 60s, wrinkled, skinny, with a long gray beard, black boots, and a flannel shirt. When I see him, I can only assume that this is Charlie Bennett, the man who was haunting my room. Now, when I awoke that Thanksgiving morning, I distinctly remember telling my dad about my dream casually, not expecting much of a reaction. Except, he looks at me shocked, as if I had slapped him in the face, and he says, "You did not dream that." That's really weird. It turns out, my parents had begun asking the neighbors who had lived in the neighborhood long before our house was ever built about our property, and if anything had ever occurred there. They found out that before our house was ever built, there was this old abandoned home that homeless people had been squatting in. However, one night, it caught on fire, and one of the homeless men inside died. Shortly after, they cleared the lot, and our home was freshly constructed just years after. It turns out, my parents believed me the whole time. They just chose not to tell me because they didn't want to give any truth to what I was experiencing. But my dad's face and reaction was more than enough for me to know how freaked out they were. I have never seen him react in such a way in my life, and I don't think I will ever see him that shocked ever again. Now, it's been nearly 7 years later, and what is so odd is that those 2 months seem to be a random and isolated few instances. I have no idea why it happened, and especially why Charlie waited years after we moved in. But I have had no more visits since. I have had random things happen here and there, such as finding the sink or stove turned on by itself, or my iPad moving into a different spot than I had left it. But other than that, I wouldn't even consider my house to be haunted. It is almost as if Charlie wanted somebody to know his story, and now that I knew, he was satisfied and could leave. If you or someone you know has a story they would like me to read or share with me, I'd be happy to do so. Please submit them to stories@whatlurksbeneath.com. Thank you. I was born in the Middle East. I won't mention the country, but the following story is all true. When growing up, I remember my name being called as if from far away, and every time this happened, naturally, I'd stop and listen. The voice was sometimes that of a man, and sometimes a woman. This obviously did not happen all the time, and I learned to just ignore it and get on with what I was doing. The Middle East is considered the cradle of civilization, based on the Abrahamic religions. That's where everything started, and so did the history of the jinn. I have heard many stories that took place within our own circle of friends, not too long before I was born. These stories were discussed among adults in a matter-of-fact fashion as real incidents that have taken place and in some cases were still happening. Dark arts, books, written in Aramaic language, are circling among certain ancient group of people who are indeed using them to control demons to do their bidding. I remember hearing adults talking about one of their friends who needed some help around the house. The friend decided to trap a female jinn and make her do all the household chores for her. Since everyone had seen this captive jinn, they also learned that even though the jinn wasn't able to free herself, she was able to disobey her human master and do the exact opposite of what she had asked to do. One day, I was playing with my sisters when I heard my name being called again. I stopped and asked my sisters if they could hear what I'm hearing. They both said no and asked what I was hearing. I told them that somebody is calling my name, but it sounds like it's from far away. While they could not hear the person calling my name, they both admitted that they too hear somebody calling my name from time to time. So, we decided to ask our friends, parents, and grandparents to see if they have experienced this strange phenomenon. To our astonishment, everyone said they also hear someone call their name occasionally, even though no one else does. During a gathering one day, we decided to go around the room and ask everybody if they've had this experience. As we're making our rounds, an elderly man who was an uncle of a relative had overheard our conversation and told us to pray every time this happens. We asked him why, and he said, "You don't want to know who is calling you, but trust me, just pray when this happens." Years passed, and I ran into this old man again at a different gathering. This time, I was determined to find out what he meant by telling us to pray. As I walked up to him to say hello, I reminded him again of what the conversation was about and the advice he had given me when I was a kid. This time, without any hesitation, and he responded, "My dear, the summoning demons are calling you. They are ceaselessly looking for the one person who will answer when they call." I had goosebumps, just listening to what he had to say. So I asked him, "What happens if somebody answers?" And he responded, "If you answer the summoning demons, you will be possessed by the one calling you, and the worst part is that nobody will ever know." My family and I eventually moved to live in the US, and since then, I haven't heard my name being called again. I believe these demons originate in the Middle East, or perhaps only the country I was born in. They might be the infamous jinn of the Middle East. Either way, I'm glad that I am far, far away from the summoning demons. I remember quite well when I was about 6 years old. I was in first grade. It was just a normal sunny day here in Florida. This particular day, though, will always haunt me because it happened so unusually. I was finishing halfway through the day at my elementary school. My older brother, who was in 5th grade, tossed me the key to our house. He had guitar practice after school, and my mother was supposed to be home, just in case I had a key. The day was over, and I was going home, got off the bus, and I headed to the door. I did not see my mother's car, but maybe it was in the garage. I tried knocking. No answer. I had begun to get worried, knocking harder and harder. Still nothing. I had forgotten that I had the key in my lunchbox, but I was just so overwhelmed with anxiety, thinking something bad has happened. That's when I got this icky feeling. All of a sudden, the door opened. I thought it was just a prank and that somebody just opened it and ran and hid. I stepped inside, and this icky feeling grew worse. I checked behind the door and the rest of the house very eerily. The last part I checked, the kitchen, and I'll never forget the feeling I got when I saw a Ouija board with its planchette taped directly on the board. I was terrified. I realized then who opened my front door. I dropped all my stuff and ran to my neighbor's house, 3 streets over. I couldn't stand to be alone in that house. After that, it was never the same. Doors would open and shut. TVs would turn on and turn off. They would even turn static, early hours in the morning. No one in my family quite believes my story, but the door was an extremely heavy wooden door that no way a 50-pound 6-year-old could bust it down herself. Most parts of Florida are ancient Indian burial grounds and swampy areas that are ideal for dead bodies. You never know who you could invite into your home. This is a short story, but I still feel the need to get this out there. My friend is out of town, so I'm taking care of her puppies. I was driving her to her house yesterday when something odd happened. I went the back way, which I almost never take going to her house, only coming from it. It's a long, winding road with almost nothing but trees, a few houses here and there, and a very old cemetery. Now, usually, when I drive through or pass by a cemetery, I mute my music. It just feels disrespectful not to. Since I don't usually take this road in this direction, I did not realize I was already passing the cemetery. Suddenly, I was hit with this incredible feeling of absolute dread, almost as if you could sense something terrible was about to happen. Like when somebody tells you, "We need to talk," and you just know it's something bad. Only this feeling overwhelmed me. I felt it deep in my chest. Just pure despair. I muted my music and was actually about to pull over on the side of the road to calm down, when suddenly the feeling had gone away. Just as soon as it had come, it went. I felt perfectly fine, besides a little confused. Not sure what else to do, I kept driving, with my music still muted. As I drove, I saw a family gathered for a burial right on the edge of the cemetery. After I took care of my friend's dogs, I drove past the cemetery again, my music muted, of course. I did not get any strange feelings this time. I haven't had a strange feeling passing by this cemetery before, after all. Later, at work, I told a couple of my coworkers what had happened. One of them joked that it might have been the spirit telling me to mute my music, as to not disturb the mourning family at the burial. I laughed her off, but in all honesty, I can't help but wonder if she was right. I have to drive past that cemetery again today, and any time I visit my friend, I will always make sure to have my music muted. About 20 years ago, my parents bought some land in an underdeveloped town just south of Baton Rouge, Louisiana. On this land, they built a large 2-story home for them and their 4 children. Flash forward to today, and it is only my parents, myself, and my brother living in this home, as my older sisters are married and live with their own families. Although everyone in my family has experienced things in this house, the story I am sharing with you today began several months back. I was brushing my teeth in the downstairs bathroom when I heard my mother speak to me through the crack in her bedroom door. This was a bit surprising to me because the light in her room was off. But I figured she was trying to take a nap due to her voice sounding so slightly tired and slightly off. It sounded as though she had her face pressed against the slightly cracked door, but it also did not sound like her. She asks me a question about my sister, and I responded before bounding down the hall and up the stairs to my bedroom. As I got to my door, I heard some noise from the other side of the upstairs portion of our home. I walked towards it, and I saw my mom sitting at the desk space we have up there. I asked her if she had just been in her room and asked me questions regarding my sister. She gently denies it, saying she has been up there for hours doing work. We brushed it off as nothing and just went about our day. A few months later, I was awakened just between 3 and 4 in the morning by my mom shouting my name from the base of the stairs. She shouted my name twice, demanding I come down the stairs. So I get out of my bed, walked down the stairs, but did not see her. I walk into the living room, the kitchen, the dining room, her office, the bathroom. I found nothing. All of the lights were off, and I was the only one awake. I went back to bed, and when I woke up a few hours later, I asked why she had waken me up and what she wanted at that odd hour in the morning. She oddly denied being up and having ever shouted my name. We thought this to be weird, but again, shuffled it in the back of our minds. So, a few weeks later, this happens again, and I was again woken up by my mother calling my name at the odd hours in the morning. This time, I sat up in bed and listened to it before deciding to stay in my bed, knowing it was not my mom. My boyfriend told me it was probably a dream or sleep paralysis. I figured he was probably right. That is, until this past weekend. On Saturday morning, my mother told me I had woken her up calling her name from the kitchen. She walks through the kitchen and living room, trying to find me, but alas, I was sound asleep. Saturday night, my boyfriend and I fell asleep on the couch, watching movies with my parents, and between 3 and 4 a.m., he told me that he had heard me talking to him. He knew it wasn't me, though, because the sounds were coming from me, and it sounded sinister. He told me that he had a weird feeling about it, and prayed until I woke up. I asked him more about it, but he brushed it off as some sleep paralysis. He does have an extensive history of sleep paralysis, and has experienced a lot of weird paranormal things, all of which he hates to talk about. He chalks this up to being nothing, does not want to talk about it, period. I just wonder if this is something I should worry about. My family, my boyfriend, and I are all Catholic. Our house has been blessed and is full of blessed crucifixes above every doorway. We do not want to give attention to anything. This is not the first experience I have had in this house, or the worst, or, I suppose, the last. I'm not sure that this is even all that scary, or paranormal for that matter, but basically everything else on here sounds more real, or more paranormal for that matter. Here, I will have 2 different stories for you. One of them about black shadows running in front of me, or waving next to me behind the shed that we had. The second being a woman sleeping next to my cousin. These happened when I was around 12 or 13 years old, the same year for both. The stories are numbered 1 and 2. Number 1. So, this could really be anything. Sometimes when you blink, you see black dots around, or you see things after you have your eyes closed for a few minutes. Maybe it's just me. When I was walking back over the rocks from the swimming area, I saw a black shadow running in front of me, around the size of a 5-foot person. At the time, I thought it was nothing, or it was maybe just my imagination. Then, later that next day, I was sitting in the porch area of our cottage, and I see the same looking black shadow, standing behind a shed, waving at me to come over to it, or waving hi to me. As I said above, this could be anything, so take it with a grain of salt. Number 2. This happened a few days or so later, and I randomly woke up in the middle of the night. What time, you ask? I had no clue, as the cottage has no power or anything of that sort. And plus, I did not have a cell phone at the time. I stood up from my bed and looked over to where my cousin was sleeping. As I look over, I saw a woman sleeping next to my cousin. An elderly lady, to be exact, that looked like my cousin's grandmother. She had dead gray skin, dark red lipstick, and a smile on her face. She was wearing what most elders would wear before they went off to bed, but it was in a darker gray color. Her eyes were closed like she was sleeping. I laid back down and tried to fall asleep as fast as I could. The next morning, I asked my cousin's grandma if she was sleeping next to him at all that night. She looked at me and said no. Most of the people were laughing at what I said, and I just said that I saw somebody sleeping next to my cousin that looked exactly like her. I mean, nothing much else came out of that, and I still have no clue what it was that I saw. I just thought that it could have been me seeing things from the dream that I was having. Or maybe it could have just been that dark that I have thought I saw something in the dark. The second one is a little more weird to me, and I sometimes wonder if that's what I saw. It could have been something from the dream that I was having, or just me seeing faces in the dark. If anybody thinks they know what it is, let me know. I went to a college in a small town in Michigan, and one summer, about 7 years ago, I had to stay there to take summer classes. At that time, I lived in a house with 6 other people, built back in the 1800s. It was a huge house with about a total of 10 rooms, but no one else stayed back there that summer, so I was in that house all alone for 3 months. Anyway, I was bartending at the time, along with taking classes, and one night, I came home right around 1 in the morning, went up the stairs to my room. I lived on a floor with 3 other people, and a light coming from one of my roommates' rooms caught my attention. Everybody had been gone for 2 months or so, and her door was padlocked, shut from the outside, so I didn't understand why her light was on. I quickly texted her to ask if I could unscrew the padlock so I could check on it. She said that it was fine, and also reiterated to me that she had not been in there for 2 months or so. Once I opened the door, I shuddered. The light was on, and it was a light switch on the wall that had to be flipped manually to be turned on. I would have noticed this sooner if this light had been on for 2 months straight. So, how was this light on suddenly? Well, I had a friend stay with me that night, but I was still pretty unnerved. A few days later, I was cleaning the whole 4-story house and was trying to really gut it of garbage before everybody came back in the fall. This house, by the way, was always rented to college students and had built up a lot of garbage that was just never really thrown away. I had about 4 to 5 huge garbage bags sitting by the front door, getting ready to be taken out to the garbage the next day, which meant the bags would sit there for about a week. I got used to the sound that the huge, thick door that must have been there since the house was built would make when it hit the bag closest to the door. Such a unique clinking sound. I was up in my room one day and had been thinking about that darn light that was turned on all of a sudden. Now, I distinctly heard that sound of the door hitting the bag. I tweaked. I called a few of my friends to help me check the whole house for maybe an intruder. They come over, and absolutely nobody else was in the house. At this point, I knew in my soul what was going on, but obviously, until you experience something paranormal yourself, it's hard to explain it to people without them trying to rationalize it. At this point, I had gone home to my parents for a little bit to visit before school started up again in the fall. I was telling my mother some of these things, and she stops me with this look of shock on her face and says, "Oh, Sam, I have something to tell you. Well, her friend is a medium and does do readings on her side, but her and my mom were just out to lunch one day, and randomly, this medium says to my mom, "Your daughter, Sam, she goes to school in this town and lives in this address, right?" And my mom was like, "Yeah, why?" She tells my mom that there are 4 spirits that live there, 2 elderly people and 2 younger ones. The younger ones like to play tricks on students that live there, while the elderly ones try to keep them from scaring the people that live there. They feel bad for scaring Sam while she lived there alone for the summer, like the time they left the light on for her. But they won't do that stuff anymore, as they just basically want to coexist with her. This medium had also made sure to mention that these spirits are not bad, and there's no need to be afraid of them. Being that this happened 7 years ago, I thought of it a few months ago when I was back with my family for Christmas and made my mom repeat the entire story to me, so I knew I did not make any of this up. She reiterated the story almost exactly the way I remembered it. I'm 23, and I'm currently living alone. Sleep paralysis and night terrors are so common for me, to the point that I can recognize them instantly and break free from them on my own. But a few nights ago, I experienced something very different. A few nights ago, I woke up in the middle of the night. I reached for my phone and saw that it was roughly 4 a.m. I'm a light sleeper, so waking up randomly like this has always been annoying, yet a common occurrence. I sighed. My alarm will go off in 2 hours. I should really try to fall back asleep, I thought. I kept telling myself to stop trying so hard. Let the sleep come to you. I even attempted meditation. But the more I did, the more I began to feel my brain inevitably waking up, uncontrollably racing through all the tasks that I needed to get done the next day. I accepted this fact and decided I should at least rest my eyes. I curled up on my side, on one half of my queen-sized bed, facing the edge of the bed. All of a sudden, clear as day, I feel my mattress sink behind me, and somebody sitting down. My eyes shot open, and I froze, confused and terrified. I felt that sinking spot in the mattress shift and heard the sheets shuffle, as if the person was dragging themselves across my bed, behind me. I lied very still and shut my eyes tight, trying to regulate my breathing and heartbeat. I told myself, as long as I can convince them I am really asleep, they'd leave me alone. I felt the person, or whatever it was, moving closer and closer to me until they touched my back. I did everything to hold in a gasp. I didn't dare open my eyes because I feared what I'd come face to face with. I could almost picture a haunting face leaning over mine, and I did not want to witness that. As if they made sure I was really asleep, they retrieved. I then let out a sigh of relief, disguised as one of those grunts you make when you're sleeping. I could still feel them sitting on my bed behind me. I slowly opened my eyes, but I didn't move another muscle. Trying not to move my head and neck, I looked around the room with my very limited field of vision. It's not real, I thought. I was just dreaming. I was sure because I knew if it was an actual intruder, I would not have reacted the way I did, and I wouldn't have tried to pretend to be asleep. I would most likely put up a fight, try to escape or scream for help. But why is that spot on my bed behind me still sunken in? I looked at the room again, and from what I could see, my room looked exactly the way it should. You know how when you recall a dream that you had, which took place in your room would always look like a bit off in your dreams. Well, I was very sure I was looking at my room with my own eyes, So it had to be real. It wasn't a dream. Then what was... All of a sudden, I felt a light tug. I flinched, gasped, and closed my eyes. But it was too late. The person began pulling my clothes violently once they realized I was now awake. I screamed and kicked and cried as I mustered up all the strength within myself to keep everything from going crazy. The entire time, I didn't dare turn around to see who it was or what it was. I pulled and kicked, wailing in the same curled position, keeping my eyes shut, snot and tears covering my face. For some reason, I believed if I let the thing pull and expose myself, I'd be a goner. Then, as suddenly as it all occurred, it all stopped. I opened my eyes again and saw that the sky was now brightening up. I sat up and looked at my bed and around my room. I was fully covered by my clothes, and there was no sign of a tug-of-war ever taking place. There was no snot or tears. I was sweating and my heart was beating out of my chest. What was that? I was beyond baffled. Usually, when I see my room in my dream, I'll remember how off it looked once I'd waken up. But this time, nothing about the room I just saw seconds ago looked off to me. I was sure I was looking at my room with my own eyes, and the mattress sinking, it all felt so real. Perhaps my eyes were really open and looking at my room in reality, but my exhausted brain somehow slipped into that realm between dreamland and consciousness and created this juxtaposition of reality and imagination and terror. But I am open to other explanations. I have always been bothered by this one experience, and to this day, still have dreams about it. I'm now 38, but this story begins back when I was only 21. Back in 2003, I was living with two roommates in an apartment in Minnesota. They were friends of mine from high school. Our life was usually pretty boring. Just three guys, hanging around, playing video games, that kind of thing. One day, I came home after working a long shift at the grocery store that I was employed by my roommate, and, of course, he had a Ouija board set up on the living room floor with their respective girlfriends. They excitedly informed me that they had contacted a spirit. They were asking it all sorts of dumb questions, like, what kind of car do I drive? Does my boyfriend love me? Just really mundane stuff. A non-believer, I jokingly remarked that the spirit was probably angry with their questions, and the board said yes. I felt it was my friends messing with me, so I decided to run a little test. I sat down with the group and asked its name. The spirit said its name was Mike. I asked it to prove it was a real spirit, and not my friends just dinking around, by telling me something only I would know. The spirit Mike responded by spelling out Sue, S-U-E, which is a sister I had not and still not met, and never told my friends about. While this was indeed odd, I was still not convinced. Next, I asked the spirit who I would marry. The board spelt out Kelly Anderson. I didn't know anyone by that name, so I laughed it off and said I did not believe Mike was real. One of my roommates, though, then mentioned that he had read somewhere that if a spirit counts backwards from 10 to 0, they can escape the board. The planchet began to spell out 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, which freaked out the girls, and they threw the planchet across the room and put away the board. I didn't think anything of it and went to bed. About a month later, I was trying to fall asleep one night, but couldn't, because I felt like something was watching me. I swore I saw a shadow creep along the wall behind my TV, that was kind of humanoid shaped, but I just wrote it off as a trick of the mind due to being tired. Finally, I managed to doze off a bit later and woke up to a feeling of being dragged off the edge of my bed. When I regained my sense, I was right on the edge of my bed, about to fall onto the floor. Still in denial, I thought maybe I had just slept funny. Now, fast forward to 2007. I'm still working at the same grocery store, and I meet a woman named Kelly who had just recently gotten a job there. I did not think anything of it because her surname was not Anderson. I got to know this woman, and we began dating a few months later. In 2009, we got engaged. One night, I was sitting with her in the living room of our apartment, and I was thinking back about the Ouija board incident from 6 years earlier. I told her the story of Mike and how the spirit informed me I was going to marry a Kelly Anderson, but I scoffed because her last name was different. She got really quiet and kind of just stared at me. I asked her what was wrong, and she told me that at one time she was thinking of asking her stepfather, who I had not met yet at the time, to adopt her. If she had done this, her last name would have been Anderson. It freaked me out a bit. In 2010, we got married, moved into a small house in Wisconsin. Strange things started happening around our new home immediately. I would hear whispers in the night as I tried to sleep. And Kelly never heard anything. Sometimes I would wake up and see the shadows of little creatures moving out alongside our bedroom door. Eventually, I began to wake up to a feeling of something sitting on my chest. I would be unable to move, and I would see this horrible being staring down at me as it pinned me. It was wispy and malevolent looking. I would eventually regain my ability to move again and fight it off. Then, it would disappear. I know this sounds like sleep paralysis, but under the circumstances, I don't believe it was something that simple. Not to mention, this continued to happen all the way to 2012, when my son was born. For 2 years, I fought off this entity that would come multiple times a week. To try and what? Possess me? Kill me? I have no idea. I was constantly tired and worn out. Throw a newborn into the equation, and I was utterly exhausted. The attacks continued until my son turned 3 months old. Then, one night, I heard a strange voice saying something in an unfamiliar language on my baby monitor. I ran into my son's room, but nobody was there. Not a thing. After that night, the attacks on me continued, but became less and less frequent. Eventually, it would maybe happen a couple of times a month. Unfortunately, in 2014, things did not work out with Kelly, and we got a divorce. She moved back to Minnesota, and I began seeing a new woman a few months after our divorce was finalized. The second Kelly moved out, the attacks stopped. I got remarried in 2016. I have been attack-free for 6 years now, but I still think about Mike and the Ouija board. Was this a spirit that was always attached to my ex? Did it attach to me because of the Ouija board, and now has attached itself to my son? I ask him if he's ever experienced anything unexplained, but I've never gotten a direct answer. I fear I never will have an answer.